I'm delighted and honored to be here today. I drove down from Greenville this morning. I had a presentation there that I made yesterday afternoon. Last night I had dinner with former Marine Michael Stahl and his wife Christy. When Mike served in Vietnam, he was the recipient of a Navy Cross and 6 Purple Hearts. So I have a great deal of respect for all Vietnam veterans. I had friends that served, friends who died over there. In 1970 and 1976, I served in the California Army National Guard, but my unit didn't get called up. So thank you very much for your service. I'm on the board of directors and past presidents of the 306 Bomb Group Historical Association. I'm also a member of the Air Force Escape and Evasion Society and on the board of directors of the 8th Air Force Historical Society. And it's the mission of these organizations to remember, honor, and educate, to remember the air war over Europe, to honor the men who fought it, and to educate the public about it. And that's what my presentation is about today. Growing up, I knew the basics of my dad's World War II history. I knew he was a B-17 pilot. He was stationed in England with the 8th Air Force. He flew bombing missions over Europe. And in February of 1944, his plane was shot down and he was missing in action for 7 months. But he evaded capture and made it back to England. But it wasn't until I retired in 2009 that I had the time to really delve into my dad's war history in more detail. My parents had kept a lot of material from the war years, and I just wanted to go through that and organize it and learn some more details. And at that time, I had absolutely no intention of writing a book. There were 2 items that were really significant. One was a diary that my dad wrote while he was missing in action about his plane being shot down. That's absolutely riveting, which is in the book. And the other were all the letters that my dad wrote to my mother while he was stationed in England before he was shot down. He was really candid in these letters. He talked about what bombing missions were like, what life was like on the air base, what life was like in England and London at the time, escapades of him and his crew. And I just became fascinated with the story of my dad and his crew and became my passion. I started reading book after book about the air war over Europe, went on the internet, spent countless hours doing research, downloading declassified military documents, mission reports, bomb group diaries, squadron diaries. I went on a quest to find relatives of all my dad's crew and asked them for any information they could give to me. Started going to World War II reunions, listening to veterans tell their stories. And finally, 3 years into my research, I just came to the conclusion that the story of my dad and his crew was so unique and so compelling that it needed to be told. So I decided to write a book.
For some reason, it's not working.
Okay, then I have to...
There you go.
Can I forward it like this?
Oh, yeah, you could do it like that.
Okay, all righty. My clicker's not being recognized here. So I decided to write a book. From the time I started my research to the time the book was published was 4.5 years. And it took me about 12 months to write the manuscript. And then I formed my own publishing company to publish the book called Seabreeze Publishing, LLC, which is the name of the street that I live on in Seal Beach, California. And then I contracted with independent professionals for all the associated services, such as editing the book, cover design, interior layout. The printer I used to print the hardcover book is located in Michigan, and then I use a fulfillment house in Indiana to store the books and distribute them. First half of the book builds up to the day that the plane was shot down, and the second half of the book is all about what happens afterwards. And it's just not about my dad, but it goes into detail about what happened to each individual member of the crew, and also about all the courageous Belgian people that risked their lives trying to help them. But I probably wouldn't have written the book if it wasn't for 2 Belgian gentlemen. On the left, with my dad in his bomber jacket, is Dr. Paul Delahaye. That picture was taken in Belgium at the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Belgium, and also of my dad's plane being shot down. And then in the other picture with me, Jacques Lelot, that was taken 20 years later and at the 70th anniversary. During the war, these men were young boys, and they were greatly affected by it. They saw firsthand the atrocities committed against family and friends. And later in life, they became local historians, and they interviewed all these Belgian people and members of the Belgium underground about events that took place involving my dad and his crew. And they documented their testimony, and they gave me unbelievably detailed information that would have been lost forever without their dedicated research. So I owe them a great debt. Initially, my dad didn't go into the Air Force as a result of the first peacetime draft in U.S. history implemented by President Roosevelt in September of 1940. My dad went into the Army, into the infantry, and he was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington. And at the time when World War II first started, the U.S. military was woefully weak. They ranked 18th in the world in military strength behind Romania. And in addition, they were very ill-equipped, as you can tell from this World War I vintage uniform that my dad has on here. 3 months later, in July, he married Ruth Hempel at First Lutheran Church in Pasadena. My mother was born and raised in Pasadena, as was I. It was right after she graduated from UCLA, where she was a classmate of the legendary Jackie Robinson. I also went to UCLA. While I was there, I was a classmate of Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. My dad was born in Norfolk, Nebraska, and he moved to California right before he started high school with his family. A few months later, on December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and the United States was at war. Well, my mother was very concerned. The future was very uncertain, so she decided to go up to Washington over Christmas and visit my dad. And 9 months later, Susan Ruth was born. Well, at the time, my dad was concerned how he was going to support his new family. At the time, he had a new bride, a baby on the way, and he didn't think he could support him very well on a private's pay in the Army, so he decided to volunteer for the Air Force, where he could make more money, especially if he could make it through pilot training and become an officer. So in June of '42, he went through pre-flight training in Santa Ana, California, and then went through the various stages of pilot training. This is a little difficult to see. My pointer's not working either, so I apologize for that. But there were three main stages of pilot training before you got your wings. The first was primary. And if you made it through primary, you went into basic. And pilot training was really tough. 40% of the cadets that entered washed out and either became bombardiers, navigators, or gunners. And then from basic pilot training, they separated the pilots out. They either went into single-engine planes or fighters, or twin-engine planes, which resulted in bombers or transports. Typically, the shorter pilots went into the fighters because of the cramped conditions in the cockpit. My dad was 6'3", so they stuck him into bombers. But I personally think it also depended on the personality of the pilots. It seems to me, from my experience, the fighter pilots tended to be pretty cocky, have big egos, be risk takers, independent, whereas the bomber pilots tended to be a little more level-headed and team players.
Nailed it.
These are the three types of planes he flew in pilot training, and primary up top was a Stearman biplane, and then in basic he flew a single-wing Vultee Valiant, and then advanced training a Curtiss-Wright AT-9 twin-engine plane. He graduated from advanced pilot training in April of 1943 in Douglas, Arizona. And then he went through transitional training in Pio, Texas, where he learned how to fly a 4-engine B-17 bomber. And then from there he went to operational crew training in Dalhart, Texas, where the various members of the crew came together and they learned to operate as a team. And then once deemed ready, they were assigned overseas to the European Theater of Operations. On October 21st, 1943, my dad and his crew reported to the 306 Bomb Group at Thurleigh, England. It's about 60 miles north of London. Here you see the insignia of the 306 Bomb Group. There were 3 air divisions in the mighty 8th Air Force. They were in the 1st Air Division, signified by a triangle. And each bomb group had a letter designation. For the 306, it was an H, so triangle H. There were some unique characteristics about the 306. They were the first bomb group to hit a target in Germany, Wilhelmshaven, on January 27th of 1943, and they were also the longest-serving bomb group in the 8th Air Force. They reported in September of 42, and they didn't go back home until December of 1946. They stayed on after the war, involved in the Casey Jones Project, which was a photo aerial mapping of Western Europe and Northern Africa. Many of you have probably seen the 1949 movie 12 O'Clock High, starring Gregory Peck. But that was based on a true story about the 306 bomb group. The fictitious bomb group in the movie, the 9/18th, was derived by multiplying the 306 by 3. Another distinction of the 306 is that their flight surgeon, Dr. Thurman Schuler, convinced 8th Bomber Command General Ira Ecker to implement a mission limit in April of '43. Up until that time, there were no mission limits, and these combat crews quickly realized that they would never, ever make it home. They'd be killed or be shot down and become prisoners of war. Dr. Schuler suggested a mission limit of 20, but Aker set it at 25. But at least these guys had a light at the end of the tunnel and something to shoot for, and the hope that they might be able to make it home someday. Here you see my dad's crew, B-17. They had a 10-man crew, 4 officers who were kneeling in front. My dad's on the lower left. He was first pilot, and as such, the commander of the plane and the crew. And then going across, you have the co-pilot, the navigator, and the bombardier. And then behind them, 6 enlisted men who were mainly gunners. 5 of these men came home, but 5 of them did not. That's not it. My dad's plane was named the Susan Ruth after my oldest sister, who was 1 year old at the time that he went overseas. This is not the Susan Ruth, it's just another B-17 they took their picture in front of. But if you'll notice in the upper left corner there, it's the nose art. I love the nose art. It was interesting that the Air Force was the only entity that allowed their planes to be painted. The Navy didn't, the Marines didn't, nor did other countries. But the Air Force thought it would help the morale of these young guys if they could personalize their planes. And they were very creative in what they named and painted on their planes. Many times it was a cartoon character, but more often than not, it was a scantily clad or nude woman. You know, after all, these guys were in their late teens and early 20s and virile young men. 306 Bomb Group flew B-17s, nicknamed the Flying Fortress because of the armament that it had on the plane. It had 12 13 50 caliber machine guns, so it put out a tremendous amount of firepower. It can also take a tremendous amount of battle damage and keep flying. Every plane had tail markings to identify it. Again, you see the triangle H of the 306. And each plane had an identification number below that that was assigned by the manufacturer. The Boeing company designed the B-17 and produced 60% of them, but Lockheed Vega and the Douglas Aircraft Company each produced 18% as well. There were 3 types of B-17s flown in the European theater of operations. First was an E model, but they only made about 500 of those. So that was quickly phased out by the F model, and then it was phased out in the fall of '43 by the definitive B-17 model, the G model. And you can always tell the G model by the chin turret underneath the nose. Here you see the crew positions on the plane. In the nose, you had the bombardier up front. His main job was to drop the bombs accurately. But in the G model, if they were under attack by enemy fighters, he manned the chin turret. And then the navigator behind him needed to know where they were and where they're going. And under attack by enemy fighters, he manned cheek guns that were on each side of the plane. Then above them, you have the 2 pilots, and you needed 2 pilots to fly these planes, and not just because if one was killed or injured, you had another guy that could do the job. But it was extremely strenuous, both mentally and physically, to fly these bombers. Back then, it took a lot of muscle to control these planes. And these missions lasted 6 to 10 hours in length, so it was very tiring. And they had to stay alert at all times, or else they could clip a wing on the plane next to them, flying in these tight formations, or run into the plane in front of them and go down. And then they had to continually fight the turbulence, naturally the weather turbulence, and most all of us have experienced those in commercial flight. But they also had to fight the turbulence of all those bombers being in such close proximity to one another. The wake turbulence and the prop wash of all these bombers being in such close proximity would just churn the air up and really make it difficult to control the plane. Then behind the pilots, you had the flight engineer. He was also called the crew chief. He was the onboard mechanic and knew how everything worked and helped monitor the instruments in the cockpit. There were over 250 different gauges, dials, toggles, switches in the cockpit, and the flight engineer would peer over the pilot's shoulders and help monitor engine performance and fuel consumption. The bombs hung in the bomb bay in racks, and it's really cramped in there. That catwalk's only 8 inches wide, and that boy's only 8 years old, so you can see how tight it is in there. And it wasn't unusual for bombs to get hung hung up on those racks, which require one of the crewmen either kick it loose with his foot or take a wrench and knock it loose. And when those bomb bay doors are open, they're looking 5 miles straight down at the ground with the wind howling around them, so that took a little courage to do that. And then behind the bomb bay is the radio operator. He had the most comfortable position on the plane, had a relatively roomy compartment and a chair to sit on. And then the most cramped position on the plane was the ball turret gunner. Again, these missions were 6 to 10 hours in length, and he's in a fetal position for hours on end, so that was a very uncomfortable position. Then above the ball, you have the 2 waist gunners, which was the most exposed positions on the plane, and another cramped position, the tail gunner. My dad flew his first mission on November 3rd of 1943 to Wilhelmshaven. It was the first time the 8th Air Force put up over 500 bombers on a mission. And flying combat was brutal and extremely dangerous. There were 26,000 men that died in the 8th Air Force, which was more than the entire Marine Corps fighting in the Pacific. Another 28,000 men became prisoners of war after their planes were knocked out of the sky by either enemy fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Being a combat crewman in the 8th Air Force and during World War II was the most dangerous duty assignment in the United States military. And it was dangerous from the time they took off to the time they landed. To begin with, there were 40 bomb groups in an area called East Anglia in England, which was about the size of Vermont. And these bases were only about 5 to 10 miles apart. So on the day of a mission, you could have hundreds of bombers all taken off at the same time. And back then, there was no air traffic control, there was no radar, and usually the weather was pretty crummy, and it was socked in, and they couldn't see anything until they got above the cloud layer. So mid-air collisions were not uncommon. Then they had to form up. Individual planes formed up into 3-plane elements. Elements formed up into bomb squadrons. Bomb squadrons formed up into bomb groups. Bomb groups formed up into combat wings. Combat wings formed up into air divisions. And all this took an hour to 2 hours before they could even begin their journey across the English Channel. Then they had to deal with the elements. These planes weren't pressurized back then, so above 10,000 feet they had to go on oxygen, or else they'd pass out in a couple minutes and could die. And it was extremely cold at the altitudes they flew. It was minus 40 to 60 degrees below zero. So frostbite was a huge problem, and many airmen were hospitalized for lengthy periods of time. One of my dad's waist gunners was hospitalized for 2.5 months. Here you see a waist gunner with his combat uniform on, his steel helmet, tinted goggles, his oxygen mask, and then he's wearing a flak jacket that was an apron that had metal plates in the front and the back to help protect him. Then his fleece-lined jacket, pants, thermal gloves, and boots. And that white strap around his waist was a parachute harness. They didn't actually wear their parachutes in the plane because it was too cramped. It's more crowded in a B-17 than in a submarine. So if they needed to bail out, they had to have their wits about it and to first find their parachute and then clip it on hooks to the back of the harness and then bail out of the plane. Next thing they had to deal with was enemy fighters. Germany had radar stations set up along the continental coast of Europe, so they knew when these bomber formations were coming, they'd send their air force, the Luftwaffe, up to intercept them. Here you see the waist gunner again firing his 50 caliber machine gun, his flak jacket, and all those spent cartridges on the floor of the plane. That was like stepping on ball bearings or marbles. And the ammunition belts that fed into the 50 cals were 27 feet in length. So if a gunner fired the whole belt, he said he fired the whole 9 yards. It was 8th Bomber Command's belief that at the beginning of the war that these bomber formations, heavily armed, flying in tight formations, could defend themselves from the Luftwaffe. And they flew in what was called a combat box formation. This is the box of a combat wing. And then within the box of the wing, you see 3 other boxes representing bomb groups. And then within each box of the group, you had 3 boxes representing bomb squadrons. So the theory was that all that interlacing firepower could ward off the Luftwaffe. But sadly, that was not the case. At the beginning of the war, the 8th Air Force took devastating losses. And even when they did give them fighter escorts at the beginning, in those years, the fighters didn't have the fuel capacity to escort the bombers deep into Germany and then back again. They could get across the English Channel and into continental Europe a little ways, but then they'd be running low on fuel and they'd have to turn around and go back to their bases. Well, the Luftwaffe would just wait until the Allied fighters turned around and they'd come in for the attack. Even though they implemented that 25 mission limit in April of 1943, it was statistically impossible to complete 25 missions in 1943. The average number of missions flown before being shot down was only 6. And the losses culminated in October of that year, when over 4 missions they lost 148 bombers. That's 1,500 men, with the worst day being Black Thursday, the second Schweinfurt mission on October 14th, where they sent 262 bombers to hit the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, and 60 of them were shot down. So 600 men lost in one day. Well, at the time, the 8th Air Force was in shock. There was no way they could sustain those losses, and they seriously thought about discontinuing daylight bombing. It wasn't until right at the end of 43 and the beginning of 44 where external fuel tanks were added to the P-47 Thunderbolts and the introduction of the P-51 Mustang that these bombers finally had escorts that could take them all the way to targets deep in Germany and escort them all the way back home. P-51s were particularly effective. By the time D-Day rolled around, June 6th, they had pretty much decimated the Luftwaffe and they had air supremacy. The next thing they had to deal with was anti-aircraft fire. This is a flak gun. Flak was the abbreviation for the German word for aircraft defense cannon. And these were deadly weapons. They fired 20 shells a minute, and they were calibrated to explode at the same altitude that the bombers were flying. And the shells were filled with all different shapes and sizes of razor-sharp metal called shrapnel, that when it would burst out hundreds of feet, it could easily penetrate the thin aluminum skin of these bombers. It was so thin you could just take a screwdriver and poke it right in it. From a distance, these shells exploding looked like little innocent black puffs. But when you got in that killing field, the exploding burst just darkened the sky. The noise was deafening. The concussions from one of these exploding nearby would just violently rock the ship. If a plane was hit directly, it would basically disintegrate and disappear. If it knocked off a wing, that bomber would just drop like a stone to the earth. My dad said even though it was so cold up at that altitude, he would be sweating profusely and his clothes would be wringing wet with the adrenaline running through his body. It was on a mission to Frankfurt, Germany on February 8th of 1944 where my dad's plane dropped its bomb successfully, but their bomb bay doors got hit by flak and they couldn't get them back up. And as a result, that caused a drag on the plane. They lost airspeed and they fell behind the formation heading back to England, and they were singled out by 2 German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters. And like wolves or lions, they swooped in on their prey. And in the ensuing air battle, the Susan Ruth was shot down. 2 of the crew were killed in the plane. The other 8 bailed out successfully. But both those German fighters were shot down at the same time. One was piloted by Siegfried Merrick. His plane crashed and he was killed. And the other was piloted by Hans Berger, who was able to bail out and made it through. One day during my research, my wife Glenda said, well, why don't you try to find the German pilot that shot down your dad's plane? And I'm thinking, she's so naive. She doesn't know what she's talking about. It's a ridiculous idea. I'd never be able to find him. He's probably died in the war. It's 70 years later. He's probably passed away by now. I can't speak German. But like a good husband, I did what she told me to do, and I found Hans Berger. And fortunately for me, became a translator after the war, so he speaks perfect English. And I found out that the gunners on my dad's plane actually shot Hans down at the same time he shot them down. They shot each other down. And he gave me some wonderful insight that's in the book about what it was like to go up against the 8th Air Force. Basically, he was scared to death every time he did it. The book goes into detail about what happened to all 8 men who bailed out. I'm just going to talk about my dad. Of the 8, some became prisoners of war, some evaded capture, and some were killed. After my dad bailed out, he came down on these trees right at the French-Belgium border, and his parachute got hung up on the branches, and he was dangling 20 feet off the ground and couldn't get down. But fortunately for him, a couple young Belgian men, Henri Franken and Raymond Dervan, came to his rescue before the Germans got there. This occurred in the early afternoon. They told him to stay put and hide because they thought it was too dangerous to try to move him in daylight with German patrols combing the area looking for him. So he hunkered down, and then the following night they come and got him. This picture was taken by Henri Franken and sent to my dad after the war. There's over 200 time period photographs in the book, so you can visualize everything you're reading about. Many taken in �44 in Belgium during the war. Here's Henri Franken standing next to the tree that he helped my dad down from. So that night they come and got him, and they took him back to the Devan farmhouse, and that's right on the French-Belgian border. That house is in Belgium, but those trees are in France. He only stayed there one night because they thought it was too dangerous for him to stay there, again with those German patrols in the area. So the following night, a Belgian customs officer, Paul Tilken, came on a tandem bicycle to take him to a safer location. And after that, my dad was moved from place to place to place. How long he stayed in any given location depended upon how brave the Belgian people were who lived there and how dangerous the Belgium underground thought it was for him to stay there. He might spend one night, he might spend 6 weeks. And he was helped by many Belgian people. This is just a few of them. You see, they stuck a beret on my dad's head to help him blend into the locals, but at 6'3", he was quite a bit taller than the locals, and the rest of his life he wore a beret quite often. And the Belgian people who hid my dad, or any downed airman for that matter, were unbelievably brave people. They risked not only their lives, but the lives of family and friends. Because of the German secret police, the Gestapo found out about it. They'd be arrested, tortured, and either shot or sent to a concentration camp. And some of the Belgian helpers that aided my dad and other members of his crew did meet that fate. Here you see my dad with 2 women that he stayed with for lengthy periods of time. On the left is Ghislaine Bayou. It was with her and her husband Maurice that he wrote his diary. And then on the right is Jeanette Guedin. Her husband was actually a captain in the French army who was captured by the Germans when they first invaded the lowlands in 1940, and he spent the remainder of the war as a POW. Normally when the underground came across downed airmen, they tried to get them back to England through various escape routes, down through France, over the Pyrenees into Spain, and then out through British-controlled Gibraltar. But something always went wrong trying to get my dad out, and he became quite frustrated. And it was very stressful for him. You know, after all, his plane was attacked, it's on fire, he's got to bail out, comes down in a foreign country, has no idea where he is, doesn't know what happened to his buddies on the crew, can't communicate with the U.S. military. He's being helped by complete strangers, and they couldn't communicate at first because he couldn't speak French and they couldn't speak English. He had little English-French dictionaries in his escape kit. That helped a little bit. And any one of these people might be a collaborator and turn him over to the Gestapo. And he had several close encounters of almost being discovered while he was in hiding that are outlined in the book. Finally, my dad got tired of hiding. Word came that the Allies landed on June 6th at Normandy, and he decided to get back in the fight. Unlike most airmen, he had that year's training in the infantry, so he knew how to fight on the ground. So he decided to join the French resistance. His helpers tried to talk him out of it because it was way too dangerous. Either he could die fighting, or if they captured him, he'd be shot on the spot as a terrorist. But he felt it was his duty to get back in the fight. Other U.S. servicemen were fighting and dying, and he thought he should too. So he convinced one of his helpers, Amy Cools, to ride bicycles over the border into France, and he hooked up with a unit of the French resistance. They were called the Maquis. And this is not the group my dad joined, but it gives you kind of a view of what they looked like. The Maquis was made up of independent small guerrilla groups, ragtag guerrilla groups located all over France. And their job was basically to harass the Germans. They would attack convoys, sabotage railroad lines, disrupt communications, assassinate German officers. And they got their instructions from the British through coded messages over the BBC. They were also supplied by the British through airdrops. And my dad said when they told him if there'd be a German convoy coming down this road on this date at this time, sure enough, they would be there. And that was a result of the British cracking the German Enigma code and knowing everything that they were up to. They stayed in this farmhouse across the border in Wallers, France. Here's a closer picture of it. That picture was taken in 1994. That's my dad in front of the building. And he stayed up in that tower where you can see those two windows. And on one occasion, it was early morning, he just in his skivvies, had shaving cream on his face, and he looked out the window and saw a German patrol coming up the road. So we had to jump out of these silos in the back of the farm and hightail it into the woods to avoid being captured. And again, several encounters that the resistance group had with the attacking convoys are outlined in the book. There was a French lieutenant, Henri Moraes, who had escaped from a German POW camp that actually led the group. It was made up of a few Frenchmen, a few Belgians, and some Algerians, who my dad said were really vicious fighters. Who took this picture and how it got back to my dad, I'll never know, but that's him fighting with the resistance in 1944. Finally, 7 months after bailing out, word came that there were U.S. troops in a nearby village of Trélon, France. So he walked into town, the town square, went up to an army major. Actually, it was an element of Patton's Third Army, which had come up through France after D-Day. And after they interrogated him, he hopped a ride on a convoy taking German prisoners to Paris. And then from Paris, hopped on a transport to get back to England, where he sent a Western Union telegram to my mother saying, "Keep that chin up, baby. Fit as a fiddle. Bank the money," because they had all that back pay from missing in action for 7 months. Belgium's a wonder little country. A lot of people don't realize it's divided in two. The northern portion is called Flanders, where they speak Dutch. And the bottom portion is called Wallonia, where they speak French. And my dad and his crew in the plane came down, we see Charleroi up there, kind of straight down from there, where all the action took place, although my dad was hidden in Charleroi for a while. And the Belgian people, to this day, they are still so thankful and so grateful for the Americans and allies coming to rescue them from 4 years of Nazi occupation and Nazi oppression. And they do a great job of educating the younger generations as well. Dr. Delahaye, that I showed you earlier, formed the Belgium-American Foundation in 1984 to honor the American servicemen who fought and served to liberate their country. And they erected a number of memorials in the area. On the anniversary date of those events, they have ceremonies. This is the memorial that they erected to my dad and his crew in 1989. And before that, like most World War II vets, my dad didn't talk about it much before then. But he and 3 other crew members that were still living at the time went over for the dedication, and there he was reunited with all these Belgian people that hit him during the war, revisited these places, and that brought it all back, and he started talking about it. And then 5 years later, in 1994, I made my first trip to Belgium, and that's when it became personal for me, because I got to see all these places firsthand, be accompanied by my dad. I've been to Belgium 6 times and have wonderful friends there and in the Netherlands. Here you see my dad during the dedication ceremonies, that Dr. Delahaye with the beard on the left, and my dad with the tie, and then 3 of his helpers. The woman in the white beige trench coat, that's Jeanette Godin, who was in that earlier picture that I showed you. And then next to her is Nellie Tilken. She was the wife of the Belgian customs officer, Paul Tilken. A couple months after he helped my dad, he was arrested, got it by the Gestapo, sent to prison, tortured, and he narrowly escaped being executed, but his health was broken from the beatings that he took, and he died at a fairly young age. And then the tall man in the trench coat, that's Raymond Dervan. He's the other Belgian man that helped my dad down from the trees. On 2 of the occasions that I've been to Belgium, I continued on to Munich, Germany to visit Hans Berger, that Luftwaffe pilot that shot down my dad's plane. Here you see us in his apartment. He's wearing his fighter's jacket there, and he has his Iron Cross on. He shot down 7 B-17s and 1 Spitfire during the war, and he was shot down 3 times. Most all of his friends were killed during the war. The only reason I think he made it is that they pulled him out of combat in early '45 to become a test pilot for the Heinkel HE-162 single-engine jet fighters that the Nazis were trying to perfect, which they never really did, but I think that probably saved his life. And then this is us at the Hofbrauhaus having a cold one. And we become good friends. To me, he was pretty much just like the U.S. Airman. He was a young guy, 19, 20 years old, trying to do a job and fighting for his country. He said it was too bad that they had to be shooting at each other, but that was war. And he says we weren't all evil Nazis. Here you see my dad and me in 2004. He wanted to see the World War II memorial before he died. And so I accompanied him to a reunion of the Air Force's Escape and Evasion Society, and we went down to D.C. To see it right before its official dedication. And that was the last trip he ever took. He died in 2007. He wasn't the last crew member to die, but he was the oldest at 91. And all the World War II veterans are in their 90s today, pretty much their mid-90s to around 100. At the end of World War II, there were 16 million World War II veterans. And as you can see from this chart, over the years, that number has been dwindling rapidly. There's only about 2% of those men left. There was no other event in history that affected more people than World War II. 60 million people died, millions more were wounded, millions more were left homeless and displaced. It changed the course of America and the world forever. And the brave young men who fought and died for freedom, their sacrifice must never be forgotten. It's our duty. Thank you.
I knew a B-17 crewman, and I know they flew daylight almost entirely, and he came back and he had serious post-traumatic stress. Of course, the movie 12 O'Clock High, Gregory Peck had, but you never heard about post-traumatic stress, what they call shell shock or something.
Shell shock, flak happy.
So they didn't treat it, I don't think. Did your father have anything to say about that?
No, he really didn't.
Would you repeat that?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, did my dad suffer from PTSD at all when he came back, or talk about it? And there was a definite adjustment when he came back. I've heard from some of my aunts that he had a hard time adjusting at first. One of the reasons, too, I think, he comes home to a wife, and actually my other sister was born while he was missing in action. So that was really tough on my mom to have a 1-year-old daughter and an infant girl and never knowing if she'd see her husband again. But here these two little girls are demanding attention, and coming back just right out of the war, he really wasn't ready for that. One time I was told that he was having some nightmare and was strangling my mother, and then he woke up. But later in life, he was fine. Yeah, I think that was just early on and temporary. Yes, sir.
The B-17 way.
I should know that, but I've forgotten. I apologize.
The question was,
what is a
B-17 way?
B-17 way. I certainly should know that and have known that, but it's slipped my mind.
Thanks.
It's pretty heavy.
Especially with 10 guys on it.
One thing I will mention that the Air Force had a rule back then that if you were shot down and aided by the underground, that you could not go back into combat. Because if you were shot down a second time, and this time captured by the German and tortured, you might give up the identity of the people that helped you the first time. The only exception to that was Chuck Yeager, who personally met with General Eisenhower and talked him into letting him go back in combat. So my dad was sent back to the States, and then for the rest of the war, he became a B-17 instructor in Florida and Ohio. If anyone wants to buy a book, I have a few back there. I've been in the Southeast for 2 weeks now, and I've had 4 presentations. And I didn't plan well enough, I guess, or the demand has been pretty great. So I ended up not shipping enough books here. But if anyone, if I do run out, and if anyone wants a book, I can just take your name and address, and I'll be glad to mail you one. If you want a signed copy. If you don't want a signed copy, you can go on Amazon and get it. Yes?
17 both weighed 65,000 pounds.
Thank you.
Google.
I will not forget that. Well, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve. I I know you need another book to carry with you around.
That's a nice small one, too.
This is a collection of stories that were written actually by these people. And also, of course, is our challenge poem. But if you're having trouble sleeping, this will help you out.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.